Nobody sent for you, old man, and nobody wants you here. Floyd Drum said it without looking up. He was reading something on his clipboard, or pretending to, his wide shoulders filling the narrow gap between the chain-link gate and the concrete wall, his steel-toe boot planted on the wet apron like a period at the end of a sentence. The morning was gray and smelled of diesel and standing rainwater, and the man standing 3 feet in front of him was 78 years old, maybe 150 pounds after a full meal, wearing a flannel shirt that had been washed too many times and a canvas work jacket that predated the site by at least 2 decades. The old man said nothing. He had his hands at his sides, loose, unhurried. There was a quality to his stillness that Floyd either didn't notice or didn't care to. The kind of stillness that belongs to people who have waited out worse than this in rooms that mattered far more. Floyd finally glanced up, let his eyes travel the length of the man once, the worn jacket, the age-spotted hands, the white stubble on a jaw that hadn't seen a razor that morning, and his expression settled into something between boredom and contempt. You deaf? Gate C is restricted. Active construction zone. Get back on the other side of that fence before I have someone carry you there. There were 11 other people within earshot. 7 were looking away. 2 had already turned their backs and found something important to study in the direction of the equipment bay. 1, a stocky man in a yellow safety vest with the name Royd Lasky stenciled on the back, was watching with his arms folded and the particular expression of a man who has decided this is none of his business and intends to keep it that way. 1 was watching with both eyes, a clipboard in her hand, and a stillness in her posture that matched the old man's, though nobody standing in that wet apron would have recognized it as such. Her name was Zariah Cole. She had been on this site for 22 days. She wore a hard hat with a small crack in the brim that she'd bought secondhand from a supply surplus on Montgomery Street. Her safety vest was 2 sizes too large. Her work boots had seen at least 1 other pair of feet before hers. Everything about her said, temp worker, hourly rate, nobody in particular. The clipboard in her hand was not for signing in. 40 minutes earlier, at 6:51 a.m., the site's internal dispatch system had logged a call. The audio record would later be entered into evidence, and when it was read aloud in a federal building in downtown Savannah, the room went very quiet. The log entry read, "Call initiated by Royd Lask, shift lead, Gate C vicinity, time, 6:51 a.m. Content, unauthorized civilian on active construction site, level 2 restricted zone, male, elderly, white, appears disoriented. Requesting operations manager response, Gate C." That was the call that sent Floyd Drum down the access road toward Gate C with his clipboard and his boot, and his 9 words that carried no warmth at all. What the dispatch log did not record, because no one thought to log it, was that the civilian in question had walked through Gate C without forcing anything, without climbing anything, without deceiving anyone. He had simply walked through a gate that the overnight crew had left unlocked during the shift change. A gate that was supposed to be secured by 6:45 a.m. per site protocol, per section 3.1 of the Wess-Canton Industrial Group Site Safety Manual, Savannah River Facility, current edition. The gate was not secured at 6:45 a.m. It had not been secured the morning before either. Zariah Cole had noted both things. She had noted them in the small brown notebook she kept in her left breast pocket, the one that looked like a personal journal and contained entries written in a compressed, precise shorthand that no temp worker on an hourly rate would have any reason to know. If what you just heard made you lean forward, stay right there. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. What happens next will stay with you. There are construction sites and there are construction sites. The Wess-Canton facility on the Savannah River Industrial Corridor was the second kind. The kind where the money was federal, the contracts were multi-year, and the safety signage was new enough that it still had the manufacturer's plastic film over the corners. It was the kind of site where the paperwork was always in order, and the violations were buried 3 layers deep inside the paperwork. Zariah had known that before she arrived. She had read 3 years of OSHA compliance filings, 2 settlement agreements, and a series of internal communications that someone, she still did not know who, had quietly forwarded to a federal inbox 11 months ago. By the time she drove into Savannah in a car she'd rented under a name attached to a temp employment agency, she had the shape of the problem. She just needed the substance. 22 days of substance were now in the notebook. The site employed a rotating crew of about 60 workers, roughly a quarter of whom were temp labor placed through 2 agencies. Wess-Canton's permanent staff handled operations management, safety compliance, and HR. The arrangement was common in the industry and entirely legal. What was less common, and substantially less legal, was the way temp workers on this site were systematically assigned to higher-risk tasks without the required safety briefings. The way incident reports involving temp workers had a habit of being filed incorrectly or not filed at all. And the way the 3 temp workers who had raised concerns in the past 18 months had each found their contracts quietly ended before the week was out. None of that was in the official record. All of it was in Zariah's notebook. She had been careful. She had been slow. She had spent the first week learning the rhythms of the site the way you learn a new city, not by consulting a map, but by walking the same streets at different hours until the geography became instinct. She knew which gates were reliably locked and which were not. She knew that Floyd Drum started his walkthrough at 7 a.m. sharp and finished at 7:40, that he spent those 40 minutes establishing dominance over everyone in his path, the way a man does when authority is the only currency he has. She knew that Royd Lasky, her assigned shift lead, kept a second set of timesheets in the bottom drawer of his trailer desk, the kind of detail you only discover if you arrive early enough and stay late enough and never seem to be looking for anything. She had been on sites where the problems were careless. This was not one of those sites. The problems here were deliberate, and deliberate problems required more patience to document than careless ones. 22 days in, she was almost there. And then, on a wet Tuesday morning at 6:51 a.m., an old man walked through an unlocked gate, and everything accelerated by about 2 weeks. His name was Norbert Wess, though the 11 people standing in that wet apron did not know it yet. Zariah did not know it yet. She knew only what she could observe, which was that he was old, that he was steady on his feet despite the wet concrete, that he held himself with the particular uprightness of a man who had spent decades expecting to be taken seriously, and that Floyd Drum's 9 words had landed on him without visible effect. He had been here before, not today, but before. Zariah had seen him twice in the past 10 days, standing outside the perimeter fence. The first time, a site security guard had walked him back to the public sidewalk, and the old man had gone without protest, pausing once at the fence line to look back at the structure rising from the ground, at the steel frame and the poured concrete, and the geometry of a building still finding its final shape. The look was not curious, it was something older than curiosity. The second time he had stood longer. No guard came. He had eventually turned and walked back toward the parking area at a pace that suggested he was in no particular hurry to be anywhere else. Zariah had noted both visits in her notebook, not because they seemed important to her investigation. They didn't, not then, but because noting things was what she did. It was, in the vocabulary of the life she had built over 15 years, simply the job. This morning, on his 3rd visit, he had not stayed outside the fence. He had walked through the gate that Royd Lasky's crew had left unlocked and stood in the restricted zone without apology or explanation. And now Floyd Drum was standing in front of him with his clipboard in his boot and his certainty that this was going to go exactly one way. Floyd took a step forward. Just one, but a deliberate one, the kind meant to demonstrate that the space between them was his to control. Last time I'm asking, Turn around and walk back out that gate." The old man looked at him with the same expression he'd worn when the guard walked him back from the fence. Neither afraid nor aggressive, just present, measuring. "I wanted to see the south wall progress," he said. His voice was unhurried. "I won't be long." "You won't be anything." Floyd's hand came out and pressed flat against the old man's chest. Not a punch, not a shove precisely, but a firm, dismissive push, the kind you might use to move furniture. The old man's boots slid 2 inches on the wet apron. His left hand went out for balance, finding nothing, and for one suspended second he tilted at an angle that concrete floors do not forgive. Zariah was already moving. She covered the 12 feet between them in 5 steps, and her hand was under the old man's elbow before he completed the tilt, steadying him with a grip that was firmer than it looked. "Easy," she said quietly. Just that one word, said to him, not to Floyd. The old man's feet found the ground again. He exhaled, a small, controlled breath. He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise. "Thank you," he said. Floyd Drum turned his gaze on her like a searchlight, finding something in the dark that had no business being there. "Back to your station." Zariah did not move. She kept her hand on the old man's arm until she was sure he was steady, then lowered it. She looked at Floyd Drum with an expression that gave him nothing useful. Not defiance, not fear, not an opening of any kind. "That flooring is wet and unlevel," she said. Her voice was even, factual, the tone of someone reading from a document rather than arguing a position. A fall from that contact on that surface could constitute a recordable incident under 29 CFR Section 1926.32F. The company has an obligation to anyone present in an active zone. She said this while reaching into her pocket with her free hand and pulling out her phone, opening it and scrolling, not performing, not showing off, just confirming the citation the way someone confirms an address before they say it aloud. Except her thumb found the section in under 4 seconds. And 4 seconds is not how long it takes someone to look up a regulation they've never used before. Floyd stared at her. "You're a temp," he said. The 2 words did a lot of work. They were meant to be the end of the conversation, the period, the door closing. "I'm a worker on this site," she said. "Those are the 2 facts that matter right now." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Royd Lasky unfolded his arms and recrossed them the other way. One of the workers who had been studying the equipment bay turned back around. Floyd Drum's jaw worked once, the way jaws do when the thing you want to say is the thing you probably shouldn't say in front of witnesses. Then he pointed at her. A short, decisive gesture that meant something without being specific. He turned and walked back toward the operations trailer without another word. Zariah watched him go. When he was 30 feet away, she turned to the old man. He was watching her with that same quality of attention, unhurried, measuring, as though he was revising something he had thought he understood. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm fine." He glanced down at the wet concrete, then back at her. "You cited the regulation from memory." "I checked my phone," she said. He looked at her with one eyebrow at a fractional elevation. "You found section 1926.32F in 4 seconds." She didn't answer that. Instead, she said, "The gate behind you should have been locked at 6:45 a.m. It wasn't. You should probably leave before someone calls this in as a trespass." She paused, "Which they already have." He looked at her for another moment, the measuring look, the look of a man recalculating, and then he nodded. Not a thank you exactly, something more deliberate than that. He turned and walked toward the gate at the same unhurried pace he'd arrived with. Royd Lask materialized at Zariah's shoulder approximately 8 seconds later. "You want to explain what that was?" His voice was low, controlled, the voice of someone choosing not to escalate in public while making very clear that escalation was absolutely on the table. "I prevented a wet restricted zone," she said. The incident should be documented. The incident, Royd said, the word arriving flat and deliberate, is that you left your station and inserted yourself into an operations matter that has nothing to do with you. She looked at him. I'll fill out the form. Something passed across his face, quick, narrow, the shadow of a calculation. Then he nodded once, a single controlled motion, and walked away. Zariah watched the old man disappear through Gate C. She watched Royd Lasky's back as he headed toward the trailer row. She stood there for 2 more seconds, then turned and walked back toward the East Foundation section, where she was supposed to be clearing debris from the pour prep. Her notebook went back in her breast pocket. The small notation she had made during those 10 seconds. Gate C, 07:14 a.m., unauthorized entry, Drum physical contact with civilian, wet apron, no safety briefing, last response. Sat in the narrow column of her shorthand, patient, imprecise, impermanent. The clipboard stayed in her hand. It was not and never had been for signing in. 3 weeks earlier, Zariah had parked a rented Chevrolet Malibu in the long-term lot of a Holiday Inn on Abercorn Street and sat with the engine running for approximately 4 minutes before going inside. This was not unusual for her. She always did this at the start of an assignment, sat in the car and let the last version of herself settle before stepping into the next one. She had been doing this kind of work for 11 years. Field work, documentation work, the kind of work that required you to become someone else convincingly enough that the people around you stopped performing for an audience and started behaving the way they actually behaved. She had done it 8 times before, in places that varied in geography and industry, but were consistent in one important respect. The harm being documented was systematic, and the systems doing it had learned to protect themselves through paperwork. Each assignment required something specific, a particular walk, a particular register of speech, a particular relationship with eye contact. You could not arrive as the person you actually were and simply decide to appear as someone else. You had to become the other person sincerely, all the way down to the way you held a clipboard and the pace at which you moved through a break room. Otherwise, something leaked through, a precision of observation, an unhurried quality in the face of pressure, a way of filing information without apparent effort, and the wrong person noticed, and the assignment ended before it should. That was the job. The job was to give them enough room to be exactly who they were. She checked into the Holiday Inn under the name attached to the temp agency placement record and spent the evening reviewing the file she had spent 4 months building in Atlanta. The shape of the problem was clear. Wess-Canton Industrial Group had 3 active construction sites in the southeast and a 4th under planning review. In the past 3 years, they had settled 2 OSHA investigations and 1 EEOC complaint, all 3 with no admission of liability, all 3 with confidentiality clauses robust enough to be worth noting. The person named in all 3 settlements as the responsible supervisor was not Floyd Drum. It was not Royd Lasky. It was not Clementine Hare, the corporate HR liaison whose name appeared on the settlement correspondence. The pattern was there, though. It just had no face yet, because everyone involved had been careful. 3 years of careful. 4 different temp workers whose contracts had ended under documented pressure. A temp worker named Cicely Parks, who had filed a complaint with the State Labor Board 8 months ago, had the complaint returned as incomplete on a technicality and had not refiled. A series of OSHA Form 300 logs for the Savannah facility that showed a statistically improbable record. 3 years without a single recordable incident in a heavy construction environment, when the industry average for comparable sites was 4 to 6 per year. When you have 0 incidents on paper and a complaint file that keeps generating names, you are not running a safe site. You are running a documentation operation. And the documentation operation had been running long enough that the people running it were comfortable. Comfort is the enemy of caution. Zariah had found that to be reliable across 8 assignments. She started at the site on a Monday. By Thursday, she had identified Cicely Parks, a compact, watchful woman in her early 30s who worked the East Foundation section and had a way of moving through the site that reminded Zariah of her own first days in a new environment. Careful, observational, not quite trusting anything yet. Zariah was careful not to approach her directly. She let the proximity do the work, shared water breaks, adjacent tasks, the natural drift of two people who arrived early and left late and did not need to fill silence with conversation. By the end of the first week, Cicely had begun to relax incrementally in Zariah's presence. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something. On the 9th day, during a break between pours, Cicely sat down on an equipment casing near Zariah and said, without preamble and without looking at her, "You don't look like you're here to pour concrete." Zariah considered this for a moment. "What do I look like I'm here to do?" Cicely looked at her then, a direct, measuring look that was more answer than the words that followed. "Something else," she said, and went back to her water. That was the beginning of their understanding. There were other things Zariah had cataloged in those first 2 weeks that did not make it into any official notation, but were part of the picture nonetheless. The way Clementine Hare moved through the site on her twice-weekly visits, not inspecting, not engaging, but auditing. The way her eyes moved over the crew in a systematic grid pattern that covered everyone quickly and logged the variables that mattered to her. Who was new, who was talking to whom, whether anything on the ground looked like it might generate paperwork. It was the look of someone managing exposure, not managing people. And Zariah recognized it because she had learned to read that specific look during her third assignment at a food processing facility in Jacksonville, where the HR director had used the same scanning technique and for the same reasons. The way Floyd Drum's demeanor shifted depending on who was watching. With his own crew, the permanent operations staff, he was collegial, almost jovial, the kind of big personality site manager who traded jokes about the previous day's game and remembered the names of his people's dogs. With temp workers, the dial moved to something cooler. With temp workers who were black or who did not respond with appropriate deference to the first signal of his authority, the dial moved further still to the particular register Zariah had witnessed at Gate C, the tone of a man who had learned that certain interactions carried no consequence. That was the word, consequence. Floyd Drum was not reckless. He was calculated. He had operated in an environment where the consequence architecture had been carefully removed, piece by piece, over 3 years of settlements and ended contracts and complaint forms that bounced back on technicalities. You could not become the person Floyd Drum was at Gate C without having had a long and uninterrupted education in the absence of consequences. The question Zariah was here to answer was not whether the education had happened. She could prove that from what she had already. The question was who the teachers were. Zariah had a working picture of the site's internal architecture. Floyd Drum was the instrument, the point of contact, the physical pressure, the man who made sure you understood that this site had a certain gravity and that certain people were exempt from it. He was not subtle, and he didn't need to be, because Royd Lasky handled the paper. Royd was the more dangerous of the two, in the way that unseen structural damage is more dangerous than a visible crack. Floyd broke things. Royd ensured the records said they were never broken. Clementine Hare operated at the remove of corporate communication, email, policy language, the dry vocabulary of HR that could say almost anything without saying anything at all. She visited the site twice a week, always in the afternoon, always with the particular efficiency of someone who needed to be elsewhere and wanted to document that she had been present. She wore blazers on a construction site. She had never once looked at Zariah directly. She had, however, looked at Zariah's name on the temp placement roster on her first site visit of week 2. Zariah knew this because she had been at the adjacent workstation and had seen Clementine's eyes stop on the sheet for a fraction of a second longer than the other names before moving on. It was the kind of micro pause that most people would not register. Zariah registered everything. Otis Brand, the safety compliance lead, was the subtlest of them. He was thorough, technically literate, and ran his safety program with a precision that impressed you right up until the moment you noticed what it was precise about, which was creating a system comprehensive enough to absorb any complaint and find it technically deficient. His forms required signatures from supervisors before they could be processed. The supervisors were Royd's people. The circle closed on itself neatly every time. And over all of it, present in the site communications and absent from the site itself, was the name of Felicia Wren, Regional Vice President for Wess-Canton's Southeast Operations, based in Atlanta, whose signature appeared on settlement correspondence, policy rollout documentation, and a series of budget approvals whose line items included, without elaboration, HR operations, site management. The phrase had no obvious meaning. That was, Zariah had concluded, precisely the point. Zariah had sent her first secure message to Ezra Holt, OSHA field investigator, on the evening of day 14. It was 3 sentences long. The last one read, "Enough for a preservation letter?" His response came back in 20 minutes. "Almost. Get me the logs." Almost. She was working on almost. The morning after the incident at Gate C, Zariah arrived at the site at 6:29 a.m., 15 minutes before her scheduled start time. She did this every morning, and every morning she spent those 15 minutes doing the same thing, walking the site perimeter at a pace unhurried enough to appear aimless, stopping twice to check something near the equipment storage, making notations that looked like personal reminders. This particular habit had drawn no comment in 22 days. The permanent crew assumed she was anxious about her hours. The other temps assumed she was the kind of person who liked to be early, earnest, maybe a little nervous, the type who double-checks things. Both assumptions served her well. Neither was entirely wrong in a narrow sense. She was earnest about the work, and she did double-check things, though not the things they assumed she was checking. On the morning after Gate C, her circuit of the perimeter took her past the south wall, the wall the old man had said he wanted to see. She stopped there longer than usual. It was a good wall, properly poured, properly cured, the form marks still visible in the concrete surface, in the particular geometry of competent work. Someone had built this well. She had been on enough sites to recognize when something had been done right. And this structure, whatever else was wrong with the organization running it, was being built right. She stood there for a moment, looking at it, and thought about the old man's face when Floyd Drum had put a hand on his chest. Not the fear that wasn't there. The other thing. The thing underneath the stillness. She had seen it before. In people who had been in rooms where decisions were made about things they cared about, and had been dismissed from those rooms in a way they were not allowed to contest. It was the particular expression of someone who remembers that this used to be different. She filed it away. She went to her station. Cicely Parks found her during the 9 a.m. water break. She came up alongside Zariah at the cooler station without preamble, poured herself a cup, and said very quietly, without looking directly at her, "Clementine Hare was at the printer this morning. I saw the email she printed." Zariah poured water, said nothing, let the silence ask the question. "It was to Royd," Cicely continued, same quiet register. Subject line said, "RE Temp conduct issue, Gate C." I only saw the top of it, but the first line said something about a compliance window closing by Friday. Zariah looked at the water in her cup. "You read well upside down." "My first job was receptionist," Cicely said. "Old boss used to leave things face up on the desk. You learn." She paused. "They're building something on you. I've seen it before here." Another pause. "It happened to a woman named Sandra. She was here for 11 days. She asked about the safety briefing protocols. By day 13, she was gone." Zariah looked at her then. "When did Sandra leave?" 7 months ago. "Did she file anything?" Cicely looked away. She tried. I don't know what happened to it. The water break ended. They walked back to their stations separately. Zariah's notebook acquired 2 more lines in the breast pocket shorthand. The name Sandra would require tracing. It would require cross-referencing with the State Labor Board database and the OSHA complaint log for Savannah County, and it would require that Cicely Parks's account of the email subject line be corroborated by something more durable than a second-hand reading from 8 feet away. But the phrase, compliance window closing by Friday, had a specific meaning in a specific context. It meant that whoever wrote that email was aware of an upcoming regulatory deadline. It meant they were coordinating a response to a complaint that existed somewhere in a system that they were monitoring. And it meant the complaint they were coordinating against was in some form already moving. Zariah knew which complaint it was. She had filed it herself, through a separate channel, through a protocol that did not connect to her cover identity. She had filed it 12 days ago. The processing timeline for a formal OSHA inspection request for the Savannah region was typically 14 to 21 working days. Friday was day 14. She kept her face entirely neutral for the remaining 4 hours of her shift. The call to Ezra Holt that evening lasted 6 minutes. She was in the parking lot of the Holiday Inn, engine off, windows cracked. The call went through a number that did not appear in any record connected to her temp worker identity. "The email exists," she said. "I need chain of custody on the server logs. If Clementine Hare printed a hard copy, there will be a print queue record." "I can get a subpoena in the window," Ezra said. He sounded tired in the specific way of someone who has been building a case for a long time and can smell the end of it from here. "You have enough for the 300 log deficiency?" "I have the dates. I need a comparison document. Their submitted log against the incident record I've been building. The Gate C incident this morning isn't on the log. I checked at end of shift. Floyd Drum made physical contact with a civilian on a wet surface. No record. Nothing filed. That's a willful violation if the incident wasn't logged by end of shift." "It wasn't." She paused. "There's something else. The civilian. The trespass? He came back. This is the 3rd time he's been on or near the site. He's elderly, he's calm, and he knows the site layout well enough to know about the south wall progress specifically. He's not a journalist. He's not a neighbor. He walked through a gate that should have been locked under Section 3, one of their own safety protocol. A gate that has been left unlocked at shift change on at least 2 consecutive mornings." Silence on the line. Then, "You think he's connected?" "I think I don't know what he is, and I don't like what I don't know." She looked at the line of parked cars in the lot. "I'm running his description through a few things tonight. Be careful with that. If you run it through anything official on this identity—" "I know." She knew. "Nothing official. I'll work with what's public." She ended the call. She sat in the car for a while longer, not thinking about the case specifically, but letting the pieces of it settle the way pieces settle when you stop trying to arrange them and let gravity do its work. Floyd Drum's hand on an old man's chest, the old man's boots sliding on the wet apron, the look in his eyes, not the fear, not the surprise, the other thing. She went inside and opened her laptop. The entry for Norbert Wess was not hard to find. He appeared in 46 years of business records, beginning with the founding of Wess-Canton Industrial Group in 1978, the year he and a structural engineer named David Canton incorporated a construction and fabrication company in the garage of a house in Brunswick, Georgia, with $40,000 in combined savings and 2 small contracts for industrial drainage work on the Georgia coast. What followed was not a surprising story in outline. 2 men with technical skill and an understanding of federal infrastructure funding built a company over 40 years. The company grew. It developed specializations in heavy industrial construction, secure government facility builds, and, in the last decade, environmental remediation site work. Canton died in 2011. Wess stepped back from active operations in 2017. His son, Kingsley Wess, assumed the CEO role at 39. Current Norbert Wess profile: retired founder, minority board member, no operational role. Home address listed in the Savannah metropolitan area. Zariah sat back from her laptop. He had built this company. The walls he wanted to look at: the south wall with its proper pour marks, the steel frame going up in Savannah River Industrial Corridor. He had built the organization that was building them. And the organization that was building them had spent the past 3 years creating a system of quiet harm that his son, now CEO, either knew about or was not looking hard enough to see. She closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet of the hotel room, the window unit cycling on and off. Outside, Savannah went about its evening in the particular unhurried way of coastal southern cities that know exactly what they are and have stopped feeling any urgency about proving it. She thought about what it would feel like to be 78 years old and to come to a construction site at 7 in the morning to look at a south wall and be told by a man 30 years younger to turn around before he had someone carry you. "Nobody wants you here, old man." She thought about that for a moment. Then she opened her notebook and added a line she had not written before, in plain English rather than shorthand, because it was not a notation and not a piece of evidence and not a procedural item. She wrote, "He knows something is wrong. He came back 3 times." She closed the notebook. She slept. Before any of the confrontations, before Otis Brand's manila folder and Floyd Drum's shoulder in the narrow passage, the first 3 days after Gate C had their own particular texture. The morning after the incident, the site went about its business with the practiced indifference of a place that has learned not to acknowledge what it prefers not to record. Nobody mentioned the old man. Nobody mentioned Zariah's intervention. The wet apron had dried overnight, and the workday's machinery had resumed with the efficiency of a system that processes disruption by simply not discussing it. Zariah had understood this dynamic from her first week. The site's silence was not passive, it was maintained. The permanent crew had learned, through the slow accumulation of consequence and consequence's absence, which things were worth remarking on and which things disappeared faster if left unremarked. A temp worker stepping forward to cite a regulation at a senior manager was in the second category. You did not talk about it because talking about it meant having a position on it, and having a position on it meant being the kind of person who could become the next problem. Zariah had spent a long time learning to read the specific weight of institutional silence, and what she felt in the site after Gate C was not indifference. It was the silence of people who had learned to be careful. What was harder to measure, and what she found herself returning to during the debris-clearing work that kept her hands occupied while her mind ran elsewhere, was the question of who on this crew might be willing to speak. Not now, not yet, but eventually, when the structure she was building reached the stage where a witness could step into it without being exposed. Cicely Parks was the obvious name, but obvious was often fragile. The most durable witnesses were the ones who came forward not because you found them, but because the weight of what they knew became heavier than the cost of saying it. She had seen it happen on 3 previous assignments. It always came from unexpected directions. It always came when the pattern became visible enough that one more person decided that silence was no longer the safer option. She did not know yet whose that would be. She just knew the pattern was becoming visible. The notebook was getting there. Wednesday brought Otis Brand. He appeared at Zariah's workstation at 9:47 a.m. carrying a manila folder. He was a careful man, careful in the way of someone who has constructed a method over years and trusts that method more than he trusts anything else. He wore his safety vest with the precision of a man who had written the vest policy, which he had. He set the folder on the equipment casing near Zariah and looked at her with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was absolutely not warm. "I need to speak with you about the incident report you submitted yesterday." he said. Of course, she said. He opened the folder. Inside was a printed copy of the form she had filled out at end of shift. The Gate C incident, Floyd Drum's contact with a civilian, the wet apron, the unlevel surface, the absence of safety briefing. She had filed it at 4:52 p.m. She had been exact with every field. Otis placed his finger on the supervisor's signature line, which was blank. Section 4.3 of the Site Safety Protocol requires a supervisor counter-signature before a form can be formally received by this office, he said. Without that signature, this document is not a valid incident report. It's a personal record. Zariah looked at the form. She looked at him. The supervisor required to countersign is Royd Lasky, she said. Correct. Who was present at the incident and who was informed of the filing? That's for the supervisor to confirm. She let a beat pass. The incident you're declining to receive involves a potential violation of 29 CFR Section 1904.7, mandatory recording of work-related incidents involving physical contact in a hazardous zone. That obligation applies regardless of the form's countersignature status. Otis looked at her with his steady, patient look. He said nothing for a moment. Behind his glasses, wire-rimmed, precise, something moved that was not quite discomfort and not quite respect, just recognition. The look of a man who has been handed something from a drawer he thought was locked. Then, you're a temp worker. I'm a worker on this site, she said. Same words she had used with Floyd. Different register. The obligation doesn't have an employment classification exemption. Otis closed the folder. He took a breath. His method had served him for 3 years and he trusted it, but he was a thorough man. And thorough men do not dismiss a reference they cannot immediately refute. I'd recommend you speak with your shift lead before submitting additional documentation, he said, evenly, without apparent heat. There are procedures for a reason. I'll do that, she said. He left with the folder. Zariah picked up her work gloves. She turned back to the debris she was supposed to be clearing. She had expected this conversation. She had documented it in the notebook before it finished. A running account, in her compression shorthand, of Otis Brand's specific words about Section 4.3, the counter-signature requirement, the temp worker qualification. All of it had a particular quality as evidence. It demonstrated that a responsible party was aware of an incident that was not recorded, had been directly informed of the recording obligation, and had responded by citing a procedural barrier that perpetuated the non-recording. That was not an administrative error. That was a pattern, and the pattern now had 3 points on it, and 3 points make a line. Cicely Parks found her again at the afternoon break. This time, Cicely sat down directly across from Zariah at the picnic table near the East Cooler Station and folded her hands on the table with the particular deliberateness of someone who has been rehearsing the next 60 seconds and is committed to getting through them. Royd talked to me this morning, she said. Zariah waited. He didn't threaten me directly. He doesn't do that. Cicely's voice was quiet, calibrated to the ambient noise of the site, compressors cycling, a distant loader working. He just said that the temp agency placement office had mentioned to him that contracts on this site depended on conduct reviews at week 3, and that workers who created complications for operations management tended to get conduct flags that followed their placement file around. She paused. He said complications. He used that word twice. What did you say? Zariah asked. Nothing. Cicely looked at her hands. I said nothing, because I have a daughter in the 2nd grade and a water bill that was late last month, and I cannot afford to not have this contract extended. She looked up. I want you to know that I'm not going to be able to help you with whatever you're doing. I want you to know that I can see what you're doing, and I think it matters, and I can't help you anyway. The afternoon sun had come out from behind the cloud cover that it held since morning, and the site was beginning to dry around them. Somewhere in the equipment bay, a welder struck an arc that flared blue-white for a moment and then steadied. "Cicely," Zariah said. "Don't." The word came out softly, without anger. "Don't tell me it'll be okay. I've heard that before here." Zariah was quiet for a moment. "I heard you," she said. "I'm not going to tell you anything." Cicely stood up. She looked at Zariah for a moment with an expression that contained more than it released. Then she went back to her station. Zariah stayed at the picnic table for the remaining 2 minutes of the break. She thought about Cicely's water bill and her daughter, and the particular arithmetic of a person who knows something is wrong and also knows exactly what they would lose by saying so out loud. She thought about the specific courage it takes to stay in a system you understand well enough to be afraid of it, but not yet well enough to have any leverage against it. She thought, not yet. Thursday brought Floyd Drum at end of shift. She was at the east gate, hard hat in hand, moving with the outflow of the 4 p.m. crew change. Floyd appeared from the direction of the operations trailer at a pace that was not quite accidental, timed to arrive at the same gate at the same moment, which required that someone had known which gate she was exiting from. The path to the east gate ran through a section of the site where the secondary access road narrowed between a concrete barrier wall and a row of material storage units. The narrowing created a passage about 4 feet wide. Floyd entered the passage from the other direction at the moment Zariah reached the midpoint. He didn't stop walking. She didn't stop walking. They came to within 2 feet of each other, and she stepped slightly left to let him pass, and he stepped slightly the same direction, filling the available space with his shoulder in a way that was entirely deniable and entirely deliberate. He was 6'2" and 230 pounds, and he was very close. "You should look for a different site," he said. Not loudly, not theatrically, just a statement, delivered at conversational volume, in the tone of someone offering practical advice that they expect you to take seriously. "This one doesn't seem like the right fit." Zariah stopped walking. She was 2 feet from him, and she did not step back. She looked at him with the same expression she had used at Gate C, the expression that gave him nothing useful. "I appreciate the input," she said. Then she moved around him, not backing up, not pushing through, but taking a slight angle that brought her around his right side, the way you navigate a fixed obstacle in a space that's narrower than you'd prefer, and walked to the gate and out of the sight without looking back. Her heartbeat did not change. It had not changed since he stepped into the passage. She recorded the encounter in her notebook that evening with the notation, "Drum, deliberate obstruction, Eastgate Passage, time, 4:07 p.m., no physical contact, verbal suggestion, leaving site, solo, no witnesses." Then she noted below it, "He knew which gate I was using." That meant the communication about her movements was running through the site operations layer, not through the temp worker layer. That meant her cover was holding. They did not know what she was doing, but her presence had been elevated to a problem that warranted monitoring. That evening, she checked the timesheet logs she had been photographing weekly from the posted crew board near the East Break area. She cross-referenced her own hours against her personal record. 12 minutes were missing. The period between 7:02 and 7:14 a.m. on Tuesday, the 12 minutes in which she had been at Gate C, steadying an old man's arm and citing a federal regulation to a man who did not want to hear it, had been removed from her credited hours and replaced with a notation that read, "Unscheduled absence, restricted period." Royd Lask had altered her timesheet. The original entry, the one she had photographed on Monday evening before the Gate C incident, was in her phone. The current entry, photographed tonight, told a different story. A 12-minute difference, trivial in dollars, insignificant in everything else. Because a conduct notation in a timesheet was the kind of flag that followed a worker's file through a temp agency placement system the way Royd Lasky had described to Cicely. Not a threat, just an architecture. A system that ground quietly and left no visible damage, only closed doors that you encountered later and never knew who had locked them. She made a second call to Ezra Holt. This one was brief. "Timeline is moving," she said. "They're escalating. I need the server subpoena before Friday morning." "Working on it," he said. "Work faster," she said, and ended the call. Friday morning, Zariah arrived at the gate at 6:29 a.m. She put her Temp ID card in the reader at Gate A. The light above the reader cycled from green standby to yellow, a color she had not seen before on this reader. Then it went red. The security officer at the gate window looked at his screen. He looked at her. He looked at his screen again. "Ms. Cole, your access credential has been deactivated." "When?" she said. "Last night. Shows here as end of contract, early termination." He had the expression of a man who delivers this particular news more often than he would prefer to. "You'd need to talk to your shift lead." Royd Lask was standing near the operations trailer, 40 yards inside the gate. He was looking at her with his arms folded in the same configuration as the morning of Gate C. He had the expression of a man who has resolved a complication. He did not walk toward the gate. He stood where he was and waited. Zariah looked at the gate. She looked at the card reader. She looked at Royd Lask across 40 yards of wet gravel. She looked, finally, at the East Foundation section, where the morning crew was already deploying. Cicely Parks was in there somewhere, beginning her day, not looking toward Gate A because looking toward Gate A was not something she could afford to do. Felicia Wren had come in from Atlanta. Zariah had seen the silver company car in the visitor lot from the street. Felicia was at the trailer now. She had been walking down the trailer steps when Zariah's credential failed, and she had paused on the second step, looked up, assessed the situation at the gate with one long look, and then continued walking toward the operations building with the stride of a woman who had concluded that a problem had been managed correctly. Zariah put the dead card back in her pocket. She took out her phone. She opened the secure message application. She typed, "Access terminated. Friday morning. Preservation request. Execute on print queue logs. Email server backup. Timesheet records. OSHA 300 log. Before close of business today." She sent it to Ezra Holt's number. Then she put the phone away and stood at the gate for one more moment, looking at the structure rising from the Savannah River Industrial Corridor. The steel frame, the poured walls, the south wall with its proper geometry. The building was becoming itself, floor by floor, with the patient arithmetic of construction work that does not rush and does not stop. She turned and walked toward her car. What she did not know, because she was looking ahead, not behind, was that somewhere between her car and the operations trailer, a man in a canvas work jacket and a flannel shirt that had been washed too many times was sitting in an old pickup truck in the public lot adjacent to Gate A. He was watching the gate. And when the silver company car in the visitor lot caught the morning light, and when he saw the woman in the blazer descend the trailer steps and look toward the gate with that particular expression, the expression of a problem resolved, the old man reached into the glove compartment of his truck and looked at something for a long time. Something that, if Zariah had been watching, she might have recognized as a business card. His own. From a desk he had not sat at in 7 years. He took out his phone and dialed. 3 miles away, on Abercorn Street, Zariah Cole was pulling into the Holiday Inn parking lot when her own phone lit up with a number she did not recognize. She pulled to the curb. She looked at the number. She did not answer calls from numbers she did not recognize. That was a rule she had kept for 11 years without exception. The call ended. 12 seconds later, a text message arrived from the same number. It read, "Ms. Cole, my name is Norbert Wess. I believe we have a matter to discuss." Zariah Cole sat in the parked car on Abercorn Street and read the message twice. Outside, Savannah went about its morning with that same unhurried certainty. The light on the oaks was the particular gold of early day on the Georgia coast. Somewhere in the industrial corridor, the structure kept going up, floor by floor, the way things built to last always do. Slowly, under pressure, shaped by forces patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment. The question was, whose patience would outlast whose? She typed back, "Mr. Wess, where would you like to meet?" He chose a diner on Waters Avenue, the kind of place where the coffee came in heavy ceramic mugs and nobody refilled your water unless you asked. And the booze had that particular quality of having absorbed 50 years of other people's conversations without retaining any of them. Norbert Wess was already there when Zariah arrived. He had a cup of coffee in front of him, and he was not looking at his phone. He was looking at the door. She sat down across from him. She did not order anything. She looked at him with the same quality of attention she had given him in the wet apron at Gate C. Direct, patient, giving nothing away before she understood what she was dealing with. "You knew my name," she said. Not an accusation, just the first point of order. "I have resources I no longer have titles for," he said. "When a temp worker cites 29 CFR in 4 seconds and then files an incident report that Otis Brand can't immediately refute, I start asking questions." He turned his coffee cup a quarter rotation on the saucer. "I've been watching this site for 7 months." Zariah said nothing. "Not the way you've been watching it," he said. "I don't have your methods or your tools. What I have is a founder's memory of how this company was supposed to operate and a long list of ways the current operation diverges from that." He looked at her steadily. "I know what the settlement agreements say. I know there have been 3 of them. I know my son signs the budget approvals that fund the systems enabling those settlements. Whether he understands what he's approving is the question I cannot answer from the outside." "And you can't ask him directly," Zariah said. The old man's expression shifted slightly, not pain exactly, but something in the territory of it. "My son runs this company competently. He built his own record here. He does not consult me on operational decisions, and I respect that. But I came to that site 3 times because I needed to see what I had been told about with my own eyes." He paused. "What I saw on Tuesday morning was Floyd Drum put his hand on my chest, and a woman I had never met stepped forward when 11 other people stepped back. That is not a management problem. That is a culture problem. And culture problems have authors." Zariah looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Mr. Wess, what exactly are you offering?" He reached into the breast pocket of his canvas jacket and placed an envelope on the table between them. "Documents," he said, "internal, from before I stepped back from active operations. Correspondence between Felicia Wren and the company's outside counsel regarding the settlement strategy. Specifically the language used to ensure that complaint resolutions would not require structural remediation. The phrase they used was incident-specific resolution, meaning pay for the event, change nothing about the conditions that caused it." Zariah looked at the envelope. She did not touch it. "That correspondence would be privileged," she said. "Attorney, client. I was copied on it," he said. "As a board member, that makes me a party to the communication, not a third party to the privilege." He held her gaze. "I have spoken with my own attorney about this. I understand the parameters." She looked at him, at the worn jacket and the careful hands, in the face of a man who had spent 7 months deciding something and had arrived at the diner having finished the decision. She thought about what it cost to sit across from someone you had never met and hand them the documents that could unravel the thing you spent 46 years building. She picked up the envelope. Ezra Holt's subpoena arrived at Wess-Canton's IT infrastructure vendor at 11:42 a.m. that same Friday, 47 minutes before the close of the compliance window Clementine Hare had referenced in her email. The preservation order covered print queue logs for the previous 30 days, all email server backup records associated with 3 named accounts, the complete timesheet database for the Savannah facility, and the OSHA 300 log in all versions, including any prior revisions accessible through the system's document history function. The IT vendor complied by close of business. The vendor's attorney later noted in correspondence that the subpoena had arrived during a scheduled server maintenance window, the same maintenance window cited in the site security log to explain the 10 missing minutes of Gate C footage. The coincidence was noted. It was added to the file. By 4 p.m. Friday, Ezra Holt had received 3 gigabytes of compressed data and a cover letter from the vendor's legal department expressing full cooperation. He called Zariah at 4:17 p.m. "I have the logs," he said. "Print queue shows a document printed from Clementine Hare's workstation at 8:51 a.m. on Wednesday. 4 pages. The email header is visible in the metadata. Recipient field shows Royd Lasky's internal address. Subject line, RE Temp Conduct Issue, Gate C." Zariah was sitting in the hotel room with Norbert Wess's envelope open on the desk beside her laptop. The OSHA 300 log? Clean on paper, no entries for the Gate C incident date. But the document history function shows that the form was opened and modified at 5:17 p.m. on the day of the incident, 25 minutes after the end of the filing window. A field that contained text was cleared. No new entry was saved. A pause. Somebody opened the form, saw that an entry had been started, your entry presumably, and deleted it without filing. That's a willful non-recording under 29 CFR section 1904.7, she said. Willful carries a penalty up to $156,000 per violation. Per violation, he said. "I've identified 4 other dates in the past 22 months where similar modification patterns appear in the document history. 4 incidents deleted." Another pause. "This isn't a single event. This is a practice." She looked at the envelope on her desk. "I have something for you as well," she said. "Documents, possibly privileged, but legitimately obtained through a board member party. I need you to review them before we proceed." She heard Ezra exhale, the specific exhale of someone who had been building a case for a long time and just felt the floor under it get solid. "Get them to me tonight," he said. She drove to the OSHA field office on Bull Street at 6:30 p.m. and left a sealed package with the duty officer. She drove back to the hotel. She sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes before going inside. She thought about Cicely Parks's daughter in the 2nd grade. She thought about the name Sandra that nobody had been able to tell her the rest of. She thought about the south wall with its proper pour marks, built right by workers who deserved a system that matched the quality of their work. She went inside. She slept. The OSHA informal conference was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 a.m. The notice of conference arrived at Wess-Canton's registered legal address on Monday morning, served to their outside counsel simultaneously. The named parties required to attend were Felicia Wren as Regional VP, Otis Brand as Safety Compliance Lead, and Royd Lasky as Shift Lead of Record. Zariah knew the conference had been scheduled because Ezra Holt called her Monday afternoon to confirm her attendance in a different capacity than the parties named on the notice. He was brief and precise on the phone, the way he was always brief and precise, and he said only, "Thursday, 10 a.m., bring everything you have." She spent the intervening days doing the work she had been doing for 22 days. Not building the case, which was built, but organizing it. There is a difference between evidence and testimony, between documentation and narrative, between having the facts and being able to present them in a sequence that makes the pattern visible to someone encountering it for the first time. Zariah had done this 8 times. She knew that the moment of presentation was where cases lived or died, not in the accumulation of detail, but in the clarity of the through line. The through line here was uncomplicated, which was not the same as simple. It read, a company had established a system for resolving worker safety complaints without changing the conditions that generated them, had used that system across 3 sites over 3 years, had employed specific individuals to administer the system at each site, and had terminated the contracts of workers who threatened to make the system visible before the system could be protected. That was the sentence. Everything else was evidence. She also spent part of Tuesday on the name Sandra, a cross-reference between the State Labor Board database and OSHA complaint intake records for Savannah County, filtered by employer name and filing date, produced a match. Sandra Brooke Tillman, temp worker, complaint filed against Wess-Canton Industrial Group Savannah facility 11 months prior. Complaint returned as incomplete, missing employer response form, which was a filing requirement but which the intake office had the discretion to waive in cases of demonstrated retaliation. The intake officer who returned the complaint had been transferred to a different county assignment 4 months later. Sandra Tillman's current contact information was in the database. Zariah composed a short, careful message through the State Labor Board's secure communication portal, identified herself by her investigation file number rather than her name, and asked if Ms. Tillman would be willing to speak with an investigator before Thursday. Sandra Tillman replied within 2 hours. Her message was 3 sentences. The last one said, "I have been waiting for someone to call for 11 months. On Wednesday evening, Norbert Wess called Zariah's phone, the secure number, not the temp worker identity line, which meant he had held on to the number she had given him at the diner rather than discarding it as a precaution. "My son called me this afternoon," he said. "He was informed by outside counsel that the company has received an OSHA conference notice for Thursday. He wanted to know if I was aware of any investigation into the Savannah facility." Zariah was quiet. "I told him I was not aware of any investigation," Norbert said, which was technically accurate at the time I gave him my documents. A pause. "He will be at the conference. I thought you should know." "Mr. Wess," she said carefully, "your son was not named in the conference notice." "No," the old man said. "He wasn't. He's coming anyway. He says he has a right to be present as the company's principal officer." Another pause. "He is not wrong about that." She thought for a moment. "Does he know about the envelope?" "Not yet." The old man's voice was even, controlled, the voice of someone who has made a decision and is committed to its consequences. "I expect he will by the end of Thursday." She said nothing. Outside the hotel window, Savannah was doing what it did in the early evening. The light going amber over the oak canopy, the streets taking on that particular southern quiet that fell between the day's heat and the night's coolness. It was a city that had seen things resolve slowly over a very long time and had developed a patient relationship with the pace of justice. "Mr. Wess," she said, "thank you for the call." "Ms. Cole," he said, "thank you for stepping forward when 11 other people didn't." He ended the call. She looked at her laptop screen for a long time after. Thursday arrived the way consequential days do, looking exactly like every other day from the outside. The same light through the same curtains, the same drive through the same Savannah streets. Until you were inside the room and the door had closed, and the particular weight of the next few hours settled over everything. The OSHA field office on Bull Street had a conference room on the 2nd floor with a rectangular table, 8 chairs, and windows that looked out onto the live oaks lining the street below. Ezra Holt was already there when Zariah arrived at 9:30. He had a coffee and a stack of folders organized by tab color, and the expression of a man who had prepared thoroughly and was ready for the preparation to matter. The Wess-Canton parties arrived at 9:53. Felicia Wren came first, silver blazer, structured posture, eyes that processed the room in the same scanning grid Zariah had observed at the site. Behind her came Otis Brand, manila folder in hand, his expression calibrated to project cooperative competence. Behind him came Royd Lasky, whose face had the careful blankness of a man who knows he is in a room he would prefer not to be in, and has decided to give nothing away until he understands the shape of it. Their outside counsel, a trim man in a charcoal suit named Parker Vane, entered with them and immediately began arranging documents at his client's seats with the practiced efficiency of a lawyer who knew that the appearance of preparation was itself a form of pressure. Zariah was already seated when they entered. She was wearing the navy blazer. She had a folder in front of her and her hands folded on the table. and the expression she wore when she needed the room to spend a few moments deciding what it was looking at before she told them. Felicia Wren looked at her. Something shifted in the scanning grid expression. A fractional pause, a reassessment. She had seen Zariah at Gate A on Friday morning when the credential failed. She had taken in the face and filed it as problem resolved. Now the face was sitting at the table of an OSHA conference. Parker Vane spoke first. Before we begin, I'd like to clarify the capacity in which all parties are present today. My clients have received. We'll get to capacity in a moment, Ezra Holt said evenly. Please take your seats. They sat. The door opened one more time. Kingsley Wess was 46 years old. He had his father's posture, the particular uprightness of a man who expected to be taken seriously, and his father's eyes, though where Norbert's eyes had settled into the unhurried patience of age, Kingsley's were still in motion. He scanned the room the way his father's had scanned the site, not cataloging threat, cataloging information. He registered Ezra Holt. He registered the Wess-Canton parties. He registered Parker Vane, who had the expression of a lawyer encountering a development that was not in his briefing materials. Then Kingsley registered Zariah, and he held on her face for a beat longer than the others, in the way you hold on something you are trying to place. He sat down at the end of the table, one chair removed from his company's party, not with them, not opposed to them, in a third position that said, I am here to understand what this is, and I have not yet decided which side of it I'm on. Ezra Holt opened the conference. This is an OSHA informal conference regarding potential violations at the Wess-Canton Industrial Group Savannah River facility, conducted under the authority of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. I am Ezra Holt, Field Investigator, OSHA Savannah Area Office. He looked around the table. Before we proceed to the substantive issues, I need to introduce a party who will be presenting material evidence relevant to this conference. He looked at Zariah. She reached into her folder and placed her credentials on the table. Not the dead Temp ID card, the other one. The room was quiet for a moment. Parker Vane leaned forward and read the credential carefully. His expression did not change, but his posture did. A slight adjustment that was almost invisible and contained a great deal of information. He had been in rooms like this before. He understood that the shape of the next several hours had just changed significantly. Felicia Wren looked at the credential. Then she looked at Zariah's face. Then she looked at the window and the live oaks on Bull Street, and her expression was the expression of a woman revising a very long chain of conclusions backward from its most recent link. Otis Brand looked at his folder. Roy Lask looked at his hands. I'd like to begin with the OSHA 300 log, Zariah said. Her voice was level and exact. Specifically with the document history records obtained under subpoena, which show 5 modification events in which completed incident entries were deleted from the log without replacement entries being filed. The first deletion occurred 22 months ago. The most recent occurred the evening of the Gate C incident at this facility. She opened her folder to the first tab. The deletion on the Gate C incident date occurred at 5:17 p.m., executed from a workstation registered to Roy Lask. I will read the server authentication log. User ID RLSAV004, timestamp 1717, document Wess-Canton SAV OSHA 300 2024. Action, field clear, fields affected, incident date, incident description, employee involved. She set the page down. No replacement entry was made. The deletion was not recorded in any changelog. Under 29 CFR Section 1904.7, this constitutes willful non-recording of a work-related incident. Parker Vane said, I'd like to reserve my client's right to respond to each item after the full presentation. Noted, Ezra Holt said. Continue, please. Zariah continued. She read from the print queue metadata. From workstation CH-CV-002, user Clementine Hare, print time 8:51 a.m., document pages 4, document title, Retemp Conduct Issue Gate C. She read from the email server backup that confirmed the recipient, the timestamp, and the subject line. She read the body text of the email, pulled from the server backup that Ezra's subpoena had captured before any deletion could be executed, in full, including the phrase that Cicely Parks had read upside down from 8 feet away, and that Zariah had written in shorthand, and that now, read aloud in a federal conference room, was no longer a piece of second-hand intelligence, but a corporate communication entered into the evidentiary record. The relevant sentence, read in Zariah's level, unhurried voice was, "We need this resolved before Friday's compliance window closes. Standard approach, contract end, early flag to agency, nothing in writing that touches the underlying issue." Standard approach, the two words that transformed an incident into a practice. She read from the timesheet comparison, original and modified versions, server timestamps showing the modification had been executed from Royd Lasky's workstation at 6:22 a.m. on Wednesday, the morning after the incident, before the site day started. 12 minutes removed. A conduct notation added. She placed both versions on the table side by side. She read from Norbert Wess's documents, the correspondence between Felicia Wren and outside counsel regarding the settlement strategy at the previous two sites. The phrase incident-specific resolution appeared in both. She read it aloud in each instance. She did not editorialize. She did not have to. She read from Sandra Tillman's account, which Sandra had provided in a written statement the previous evening. A statement that described, in the specific chronological language of someone who has been organizing the memory of an event for 11 months, the sequence by which her complaint had been filed, returned on a technical deficiency, and followed within 48 hours by a conversation with Royd Lasky that used the word complications. Same word. Third documented use. When she finished, the room was quiet in a way that conference rooms are rarely quiet. Not the silence of people waiting for their turn, but the silence of people accounting for something. Kingsley Wess was looking at his folder. He had not opened it. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, and he was very still. And the stillness was not the stillness of a man with nothing to say, but the stillness of a man who has just understood something he is going to have to live with for a long time. Parker Vane spoke. He was measured and technically precise. He was a skilled attorney, and he deployed his skill appropriately. He challenged the privileged status of the Norbert Wess correspondence. He noted that the timesheet modification timestamps were not independently authenticated by a neutral party. He argued that the 300 log modification could reflect a clerical correction rather than willful suppression. He preserved his client's Fifth Amendment rights regarding the Sandra Tillman account. Ezra Holt listened to all of it. He made notes. When Parker Vane finished, he said, "The privilege question on the board member correspondence will be evaluated by the agency's legal office. The timesheet timestamps were authenticated by the IT vendor under subpoena, and I have their certification letter here." He placed it on the table. The clerical correction argument regarding the 300 log is inconsistent with the pattern across 5 deletion events and 2 sites. And the Sandra Tillman account is one of 3 worker accounts we have received. The other 2 were provided directly to this office by workers currently or formerly employed at Wess-Canton facilities in Georgia. The number 3 landed in the room with a particular weight. Parker Vane's posture adjusted again. The same almost invisible shift as before, containing the same information. Felicia Wren spoke for the first time since the conference began. Her voice was controlled and professional, and she said, "Wess-Canton Industrial Group takes its OSHA compliance obligations seriously and will cooperate fully with any formal investigation." It was the right sentence. It was also the sentence that meant she was no longer defending the position. Royd Lasky said nothing. Otis Brand said nothing. Ezra Holt said, "Thank you. The agency will issue its citation and notification of penalty within the statutory period. Given the pattern documentation, the citations will be classified as willful under 29 U.S.C. Section 666A. Each violation carries a maximum penalty of $156,259. He paused to let the arithmetic settle. "We have identified 5 documented violations. The agency will also be referring the timesheet modification and the pattern of contract terminations to the EEOC Southeast Region for evaluation of potential violations under 42 U.S.C. Section 1981 and the anti-retaliation provisions of 29 U.S.C. Section 660C. He looked around the table. "This conference is adjourned. My office will be in touch with the formal citation documents within the statutory 30-day period." Chairs moved. People gathered their materials with the particular efficiency of people who want to be in a different room from the one they are currently in. Royd Lasky was the first out the door. He moved quickly, without looking at anyone, with the stride of a man calculating the distance between where he was and somewhere safer. He was in the elevator before Parker Vane had finished packing his briefcase. Kingsley Wess did not move immediately. He sat at the end of the table while the room emptied around him, still with his hands flat on the folder he had not opened. And when the room was down to him and Zariah and Ezra Holt, he looked up. He looked at Zariah for a moment. Then he said quietly, "How long has this been happening?" 3 years documented, she said, "possibly longer." He absorbed this. The settlements were structured to avoid fixing the underlying conditions, she said. "That's in the correspondence your general counsel received this morning." He looked at the table. Something moved through his expression. Not shock precisely, because a man who has run a company for 7 years does not believe he is immune from the possibility of institutional failure. But the specific weight of finding out that the system had been designed rather than merely negligent. Designed by people whose salaries he had approved, whose performance reviews had called them effective. "My father called me this morning," he said, "before I drove here." He said, a pause, he said that the company was going to have an opportunity to do the right thing today, and he wanted me to take it. Zariah said nothing. He also said that a woman he had never met stepped forward for him at Gate C when nobody else did, Kingsley said. He said he wanted me to understand what that meant about how this site had been operating, that a civilian had to step forward. He exhaled. "I understand it." He stood up. He picked up his folder. He looked at Ezra Holt. "Whatever the agency requires from the company's principal officer, full document access, systems review, cooperation with the EEOC referral, you'll have it." He looked at Zariah. "From me directly, not filtered through outside counsel." He left the room. What followed was not swift, because real accountability is not swift, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. The OSHA citations were issued 31 days later. 5 willful violations, total proposed penalties of $412,000. Wess-Canton's outside counsel filed a notice of contest, which was standard practice and which extended the timeline by approximately 6 months, while the agency and the company's legal team negotiated the terms of an informal settlement agreement. The informal settlement, reached 14 weeks after the conference, required Wess-Canton to pay $320,000 in penalties, reduced from the proposed amount in exchange for full cooperation and immediate corrective action. It required the implementation of mandatory safety briefings for all workers, regardless of employment classification. It required an independent auditor to review all OSHA 300 log entries for the previous 3 years across all active sites. It required the establishment of an anonymous reporting channel accessible to temp and contract workers, administered by a third party. It did not require an admission of liability. That was in the standard language. Floyd Drum was suspended without pay pending an internal investigation. The investigation took 11 weeks. At the conclusion of the investigation, his employment was terminated. His union filed a grievance. The grievance was pending at the time this account was written. Royd Lasky resigned 14 days after the OSHA conference, before any formal disciplinary action was initiated. His resignation letter cited personal reasons. Parker Vane's office confirmed that Royd had retained separate legal counsel. No charges had been filed at the time of writing. The DA's office for Chatham County indicated the timesheet modification referral was under review. Clementine Hare was transferred to Wess-Canton's corporate compliance office in Atlanta, a reassignment that her personnel file described as a promotion. The email marked Temp Conduct Issue Gate C was listed as Exhibit 4 in the EEOC referral file. Whether that referral would result in a civil rights action and on what timeline remained the province of a process that moved at its own pace and answered to nobody's impatience. Felicia Wren remained Regional VP. Her name appeared in the EEOC referral. Her name appeared in 3 of the 5 OSHA citations as the senior officer who had approved the site safety protocols under which the violations occurred. Preliminary findings from the agency indicated that her role in the settlement strategy would be examined as part of a broader pattern of practice review. Whether that examination resulted in individual liability, professional sanction, or the particular quiet resolution that institutional power tends to produce for people who have spent careers learning to navigate it, that question was still open. Otis Brand cooperated with the internal audit. He provided documentation that clarified the Section 4.3 counter-signature requirement had been implemented on his recommendation, but reviewed and approved by Felicia Wren's office. Whether that distinction would matter to the auditors was not yet determined. Cicely Parks's contract was renewed. Kingsley Wess signed the renewal order himself. He also signed the authorization for the anonymous reporting channel and the independent audit, and he showed up personally at the Savannah site on the day the new safety briefing protocol was implemented for the first time. And he stood in the morning assembly and said, in front of the full crew, that what had happened on this site was his responsibility to fix, and that fixing it would not be a press release, but a practice. Whether the practice would outlast the press attention, that was the question Savannah would be answering, slowly, over time. Sandra Tillman's case was reopened by the State Labor Board on the strength of the new documentation. Her original complaint, returned as incomplete 11 months prior, was found to have met the filing requirements at the time of submission. The technical deficiency cited in its return had been a matter of interpretive discretion rather than a clear statutory requirement. The investigator assigned to the reopened case was not the investigator who had made the original determination. Whether Sandra Tillman's case would reach a resolution that meant something to her in practical terms, in her working life, in her file, in the specific small dignity of having a record that said she had been right to speak, was a question for a process that moved in months and years, not days. But the case was open. That was not nothing. 6 weeks after the conference, Zariah was in her Atlanta office when her desk phone rang. Not the secure line, the direct office number listed in agency directories. It was Norbert Wess. "I wanted to tell you," he said, "that I drove to the site this morning." She waited. "The south wall is finished," he said. "It looks exactly right." She thought about that for a moment. The old man in his pickup truck in the public lot, looking through the fence at the wall going up. 46 years of a company distilled into the proper geometry of poured concrete. She thought about the first time she had seen him stand outside that fence, the quality in his posture that she had not been able to name until she was sitting in the diner across from him and understood that the thing in his posture was responsibility. Not guilt, but the specific weight of a founder's accountability for what the thing he built had become. "Mr. Wess," she said, "I'm glad it looks right." "I owe you more than I can express," he said. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "You handed me the envelope. That was the harder thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's something else. The building. The one going up on the south wall, it was a federal contract, environmental remediation. The site work affects drinking water infrastructure for 3 counties. A pause. If the safety practices had continued the way they were going, and if there had been a serious accident, not a near miss like what happened at Gate C, but an actual structural failure or a worker fatality, the contamination liability alone would have exceeded the company's insurance coverage. Another pause. My son understands that now. He asked me to tell you. Zariah looked at the window of her office. Outside, Atlanta moved through its Tuesday with the particular focused urgency of a city that has always been more interested in where it's going than where it's been. Tell him I'm glad the process worked the way it was supposed to, she said. She meant it. The process was slow and imperfect and left too many threads open and produced outcomes that were partial and contingent and dependent on follow-through that was not guaranteed. But it had worked. This time, on this case, with these specific pieces in this specific order, it had worked. That was enough. It had to be. In the week after the conference, Dahlia Marsh at the Savannah Herald filed a FOIA request for the OSHA citation documents and the conference record. The FOIA response came back with 2 items redacted, a pair of email chains from Felicia Wren's inbox that had been pulled into the investigation file, but not yet processed for public release. The redaction notation said, "Withheld pending review. No timeline given." Dahlia Marsh filed a follow-up request for the timeline of that review. The response came back, "Under determination." 2 weeks later, she received a padded envelope at the Herald's mailroom. No return address. Inside was a USB drive. Inside the USB drive was a folder. The folder contained a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet had 4 columns: site name, date range, named supervisor, incident count. There were 4 rows. The first 3 corresponded to the Wess-Canton sites Zariah had documented. The 4th row contained a company name she did not recognize. The supervisor name in that row was not Floyd Drum. It was not Roy Lasky. It was a name that appeared nowhere in the OSHA file, nowhere in the settlement records, and nowhere in any document that had been subpoenaed, preserved, or produced in the entire course of the Wess-Canton investigation. Dahlia Marsh stared at the screen for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called the number on a business card she had been given at a press briefing 3 months ago. The briefing where the OSHA citations had been announced. The call went to voicemail. She left a message. She said, "I think the Wess-Canton story isn't finished. I think it never was. And I think whoever sent me this is trying to tell us something we haven't asked the right question about yet." She hung up. She looked at the spreadsheet. She looked at the 4th row. Outside, on Bay Street, the Savannah River moved through the city the way it always had. Patient and persistent, carrying whatever was put into it, eventually, out to the sea. The question was, what was still in the water? Zariah Cole did not step forward at Gate C because she knew who Norbert Wess was. She stepped forward because an old man was about to fall on wet concrete, and 11 people had already decided that was not their problem. That is the whole lesson, and it is not a small one. The systems that cause the most harm rarely announce themselves. They survive on ordinary people looking away at ordinary moments. The hand on the chest, the erased form, the contract quietly ended before anyone asked the inconvenient question. They endure because silence is easier, and because most people have calculated correctly that stepping forward costs something. What this story proves is that the cost of not stepping forward is always higher. It is paid later, by more people, in ways that are nearly impossible to trace back to the original moment of looking away. You do not need a credential to be the person who steps forward. You need only the decision. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone it might reach. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And the next time you find yourself in that wet apron, watching something happen, remember that 11 people looked away and 1 did not. And the difference between those 2 choices was everything.